You're live.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Free Assange Vigil. This is week 63. My name is Steve Poikinen. I am joined by my co-host Andrew Smith. We will be hearing from Kendra Christian later on in the broadcast today, who will be live from Denver, Colorado at a Free Assange event she is putting together. Our guest should be joining us sometime shortly. But in the meantime, let's run through some numbers. Today marks 3,573 days of illegal and arbitrary detention for Julian Assange, 527 days since the WikiLeaks founder was trafficked from the Ecuadorian embassy after being sold to the United Kingdom for a $4.2 billion IMF loan. Julian was held without arrest, where my screen just jumped. There we go. From 24 June 2020 until he was rearrested on September 7th under the new superseding indictment issued by Bill Barr's Justice Department. Something like 50 days or 48 days remain for the DOJ to file new and additional charges. I would not be surprised if that happens. Today is the end of the second full week of the extraordinary rendition and broad daylight kidnapping, passing as a hearing at the Old Bailey. We have 1,205 days of incarceration in federal custody for Reality Winner. And on the one bright side, we have 186 days of freedom for Chelsea Manning, who streams 4 days a week on Twitch, Thursday through Sunday from 7 to 11 p.m. East Coast time. With that, I will turn it over to Andrew for today's call to action.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. So we have multiple call to actions up on our website that we put out first and second week. I will be putting out a new one this week, but just to review them, we have the Reporters Without Borders coordinated campaign to contact congressional candidates, Senate and House of Representatives. We have the U.S. Department of Injustice, which is educating the Department of Justice on what is actually happening in Julian's case, as well as the things that have historically happened to him, like the torture rulings, the UC Global case, things like that. We have the Abysmal Technological Incompetence call to action, which is reaching out to the UK court system, like Her Majesty's prisons and other things in there, that basically say, hey, this either needs to be able to be broadcast to NGOs or just released to the public. Like there needs to be a full public view, or it needs to just be completely open, because at this point, the technological incompetence has reached a level of absurdity to the point that we've lost days of the trial simply because the court had no idea how to handle their own technology. There is a couple others, but the one that I will be putting out today shortly after the vigil is going to be contacting the entirety of the Australian Parliament. I went through, I'm just waiting on making sure I don't get any bounce backs from my list, but we have all of the emails for all of the Australian parliamentary members, short of like 3 of them. And so we're going to be sending them information about Julian's court case and pressuring them to demand that Australia actually defend its citizen. So I'm really looking forward to getting that one up there, because we've made a lot of impact just with the ones that we've had up so far. But the last one to mention, there is a link to the U.S. Pardon Office and a call to action for Julian to be pardoned. It's like the Office of the U.S. Pardon Attorney. There's a form, a phone number, and an email address. If you have not done that, please send them information, demand that Julian be pardoned, give them updates on the court case and how it should be thrown out. Whatever you want to send them, just please send them at least one, if not a handful of emails and form submissions, because this is crunch time. But with that, we are waiting on our guests to hop in, but we are going to start by digging into an article here real quick. Unless there's anything you want to add or say, Steve?
No, let's go right into the Shadowproof article.
Yeah. So there was a lot of talk in the court about this particular incident. This is, I believe it's pronounced Khalid El-Masri. I'm really bad with names, so I would like to apologize if I got that wrong.
Khalid El-Masri.
Khalid El-Masri. But he was a victim of the CIA's rendition program. He was kidnapped out of a country while he was on vacation. He was shipped to what was called ominously the Salt Pit. in Afghanistan, where he was raped, tortured, and held politically because the U.S. didn't want the embarrassment of having to release an innocent man that they had tortured so heavily for so long back into the general population. So that is the article we have up here that we're going to run through for you guys. It's pretty dark and heavy, but I think it is a super important topic to cover because it is something that the court got his statement read to it over the weekend, or not over the weekend, but yesterday.
And real quick, just huge shout out to Kevin Gostola for the just incredible body of work that he's put together, both on Shadowproof and working his narrow behind off to cover this trial. Andrew, I'm getting some echo. I don't know if that's you or if it's
That's
Josh.
It's probably me.
He needs to
My
go.
mic's by my headset.
At any rate, let me jump into this. Khalid al-Masri, a survivor of CIA kidnapping, torture, rendition, and detention, submitted testimony in support of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange during his extradition trial. The Central Criminal Court in London was prepared for al-Masri to testify. An interpreter was lined up for the 9th day of proceedings. However, technical problems, once again, prevented him from addressing the court beyond his written statement. Prosecutors also objected to al-Masri giving live testimony. According to Court News UK reporter Charlie Jones, that prompted Assange to stand up and declare, "I will not accept you censoring a torture victim's statement to this court."
And real quick, if I could throw something in there just to kind of editorialize as we're going through here.
That needs to be on signs in front of the Old Bailey, along with signs that say, "Does shouting help?"
And so you have the prosecution saying, "No, we don't want this testimony. Do not let this person talk." And then there just happens to be these technical issues that prevent him from actually being cross-examined as a witness. So I want to make sure that those two things can be taken in context to one another, because he didn't get a chance to give an oral testimony because of tech issues. And the prosecutors didn't actually want him to give a live testimony. So there was only the ability to have that statement read in court. So I just wanted to make sure that was clarified.
So jumping back in, al-Masri's testimony directly relates to the defense argument that Assange published classified information from the U.S. in order to reveal abuses and misconduct, such as torture and war crimes. In the United Kingdom, Assange's legal team has been allowed to enter this evidence into the public record. However, during a potential trial in the U.S., it will likely be excluded as irrelevant because the Espionage Act does not allow a public interest defense. Assange is accused of 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act and 1 count of conspiracy to commit a computer crime that, as alleged in the indictment, is written like an Espionage Act offense. The charges criminalize the act of merely receiving classified information as well as the publication of state secrets from the U.S. government. It targets common practices in news gathering, which is why the case is widely opposed by press freedom organizations throughout the world. This cannot be stressed enough. The case against Julian Assange has ultimately very little to do with Julian Assange as a human being. It has everything to do with criminalizing the way that actual journalism is practiced, not just in the US, but globally. So please, everybody, like when you do talk to people about this, make sure that you hammer that point home. Al-Masri declared, "I record here my belief that without dedicated and brave exposure of state secrets in question, what happened to me would never have been acknowledged and understood." He added, "Threats and intimidation are not diminishing, but expanding for all concerned. I nevertheless believe that the exposure of what happened was necessary, not just for myself, but for law and justice worldwide. My story is not yet concluded." As al-Masri noted, he submitted testimony because, quote, WikiLeaks publications were relied on by the European Court of Human Rights in obtaining the redress he received. Skip down a little bit here. Al-Masri also mentioned the WikiLeaks cable similarly showed that the U.S. government interfered in a judicial investigation in Germany and Spain. The rendition flight in question traveled from Palma Airport in Spain. So if you guys don't know, the backstory on this is that Khalid al-Masri was a German citizen, and this ultimately led to a German court opening an indictment against the CIA team that kidnapped him and removed him from his country so that they could sodomize and torture him.
And this was after years and years of him being insulted and degraded by news outlets and media outlets until Der Spiegel was willing to actually carry
Now,
his story too.
was it Der Spiegel or was it Freitag?
I think it was like front page headline big story in Der Spiegel that got ran. Yeah. Okay. I may be wrong, but I believe that that's just from what Kevin was saying. I believe that it was Der Spiegel that actually forced his story into the general public.
So I'm going to jump down to the part where it says the CIA torture and rendition of al-Masri. By submitting testimony in Assange's extradition trial, al-Masri took a great risk. It is already known that the CIA supported UC Global, a Spanish private security company, in an espionage operation that targeted Assange while he was living under political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Al-Masri had also been denied any semblance of justice by the U.S. government for what was done to him. Therefore, while the details of what happened to al-Masri are well known, I'll recount what was summarized in his statement. At the Macedonian border, al-Masri was kidnapped, detained, and held incommunicado and abused for 23 days. On January 23rd, 2004, a CIA rendition team handcuffed and blindfolded him at Skopje airport. A CIA rendition team physically overwhelmed al-Masri and cut off all his clothes except his blindfold. The European Court of Human Rights confirmed 9 years after that al-Masri was severely beaten, sodomized, shackled, and hooded, and subjected total sensory deprivation, carried out in the presence of state officials of Macedonia and within its jurisdiction. Macedonia's government was consequently responsible for those acts performed by foreign officials. Those measures had been used with premeditation, the aim being to cause Mr. Masri severe pain and suffering in order to obtain information. When his blindfold was removed, al-Masri recalled flash photography temporarily blinded him. He then saw 7 or 8 men wearing black and black masks. They put him in a diaper and tracksuit with a bag over his head and earmuffs. He was shackled and marched to an aircraft. The rest of this is pretty fucking brutal, and I'm not even sure if I want to read it. Like, I don't know.
I think it's worth going over just because this is going to be one of the stories that most people don't talk about. And that's just because it is so dark. So I think that we're in a particularly individual position to be able to put something like this in audio form. Do you want me to pick it up, though?
No, I mean, I got it. It's just fucking nuts. On the plane, I was spread eagled and my limbs tied to the sides of the aircraft. I was given injections and an anesthetic. I was unconscious for most of the journey, according to al-Masri, who later learned he was in Afghanistan. He was held incommunicado on a cold concrete cell in winter, humiliated, stripped naked, insulted, and threatened. He was interrogated and in March 2004 initiated a hunger strike. On the 34th day of the hunger strike, al-Masri said he was dragged from the cell to an interrogation room, tied to a chair, and a tube was painfully forced through his nose. Al-Masri discovered later that the CIA knew his detention was a result of mistaken identity. They understood he should be released, but kept him detained for several more months. By May 2004, al-Masri learned he would be released. He was interrogated once more and warned as a condition of his release that he was never to mention what happened or there would be consequences. Al-Masri was blindfolded and shackled again on May 28th. He was let out of his cell, handed the suitcase he arrived with in Skopje, and told to change back into the clothes he had in Macedonia. Then al-Masri was brought to an aircraft and subject to what can only be described as a reverse rendition. He was blindfolded, earmuffed, and chained to a seat. He was informed he would eventually land in a European country and then be allowed to return to Germany. The plane landed in Albania. He believed when he landed he would be shot in the back. They asked him why he was in Albania with no permission because he had a German passport. He said he didn't know where he was.
That's what WikiLeaks helped to reveal. That's the basic premise of this court case, is that the U.S. prosecution doesn't want information like this going out to the general public. to the point that the U.S. prosecution didn't even want El-Masri to testify. And then technological issues got in the way of actually hearing his words describing all of this. And so I just want to make sure that people can fully grasp the information that needs to come out in all of this, because it's something that this isn't generally known to the population, like the rendition programs and the CIA torture, but the fact that they're allowed to just whisk an innocent man away for months. Literally, they say sodomize, but I'll just call it rape for what it is. Keep this man blindfolded, shackled, drugged, drag him around, and then drop him off in a country that's not even his own is just disgusting. And there's a reason the U.S. prosecution didn't want it in there.
Well, and this is a rare instance where U.S. intel agency abuses are being heard because they did read the statement out loud in court. So the abuses of the U.S. intel agencies are finally being aired in a British courtroom, and that's something that hardly ever, if ever, happens. The fact that this would be viewed as extraneous information not worth covering in the Eastern District of Virginia because it involves a public interest defense highlights what Reporters Without Borders is trying to do to amend the Espionage Act. This is absolutely in the public interest, and because of that, it is absolutely protected speech. That's my opinion, but according to the article, there's a lot to back that up. On September 16th, John Getz, a German journalist who worked for Der Spiegel from 2010 to 2011, provided a statement to the court to help reinforce El-Masri's testimony. The investigation into what happened to him was as difficult as anything I have worked on. It was only years later, when WikiLeaks published U.S. diplomatic cables, that I finally found an explanation about why there were so many difficulties during the investigation. It revealed not only that significant information had been suppressed, but I finally understood why there were no repercussions when that information was revealed. The U.S. diplomatic cables revealed the extent of pressure brought upon the German authorities and, in parallel, relevant Spanish authorities not to act upon the clear evidence of criminal acts by the USA, even though by then exposed. Every impediment has been and continues to be placed in the appropriate resolution and conclusion of his case, including acceptance and responsibility by the primary perpetrators of the atrocities against him, the USA. The impediments have taken a further and disturbing course to this day, with threats and intimidatory, God, that's a clunky fucking word, with threats and measures of intimidation being announced by the relevant minister, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, threatening retribution upon those party to bringing cases, of which Mr. El-Masri's case is currently one, to the ICC. And this is something that people forget frequently. Mike Pompeo at State and the Trump administration in general has been beyond openly hostile to the International Criminal Court, threatening individual members of the ICC, threatening the body itself with whatever sanctions they can use against them.
The family members of the people in the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's specifically, and not only, but one of the cases is El-Masri's case that the ICC is pursuing. And that's what is literally on trial while the International Criminal Court is getting sanctioned.
Absolutely. I blanked out there for just a second. Let me jump back into the article. Getz wrote, the intimidation surrounding this case, frequently intruding in the past, as he described, at times covert, is now manifestly overt. I note that the denial of the right to truth referred to by the European Court in relation to Mr. El-Masri has had severe and enduring effects upon Mr. El-Masri and his family. It remains difficult even for those closer closely reporting on the history of the last 15 years for Mr. El-Masri to fully explain the extent of his continuing trauma and the need for it to be addressed and recognized by those responsible to acknowledge the truth. Yeah, she traveled to North Carolina to confront members of the CIA team behind El-Masri's rendition, further declared, without publication of information that the U.S. government intended to be kept secret for national security reasons, the entire truth would still be buried, because it was only when reading the diplomatic cables that we saw the role the U.S. government was playing behind the scenes. This is incontrovertible evidence that the release of Cablegate is not only justified and necessary, but vital to a functioning society. That's me editorializing. That's not in the article. I just feel like it needs to be said.
And it needs to be held to account too, and it needs to be properly addressed, because these programs haven't ended. Nancy Pelosi, I believe, through Cablegate, we found out, was read in on torture programs as early as 2003. So these are things that are still ongoing. Guantanamo Bay is still open. These programs and these black sites and these wars that revolve around them are still unfolding around the world. So the fact that this is coming out in court while there's probably still other people inside of these same situations is, I don't know, like, insane. Do we want to hop over, though, and talk about the UC Global case?
Might as well. I'm not sure what the holdup is with our guest today.
Probably a
It
time
is like,
zone thing.
yeah, I mean, it is like 1 o'clock in the morning there or something like that.
Yeah,
But
it may be better for a Tuesday because we're literally 12 hours apart between here and Syria.
She said she preferred it. I don't know. We do it live.
We do it live.
We do it live.
Do we want to hop over to the El País article? Because we've talked about this a little bit, but I don't think we've ever read through the whole thing. At least not on a vigil.
Yeah, I do want to make a point here real quick. In my chat, Tar Alm says Merarar, a Syrian Canadian, was kidnapped by the CIA while in transit to JFK on his way back to Canada. He was renditioned to the Syrian regime where he was tortured for months. It's a very similar story. Got Jason Burmis in the chat cracking up over fucking We Do It
Tell him
Live.
to hop
That's
in.
for you, buddy.
I'm
That's
sending
for you.
Jason the
I
link.
just want you to know I love you, Jason Burmis, and yeah, that's for you. It is. But no, I mean, to not make light of like the kidnapping, torture, sodomizing, and rendition of perfectly freely doing nothing the fuck wrong citizens. It's something that the CIA has become known for. And in fact, WikiLeaks has exposed through the release of the Gitmo files and Cablegate the very political nature of the rounding up of individuals and having them sent to Gitmo, having them sent to other black sites where people can be tortured, has nothing to do with whether or not these people are terrorists and everything to do with who they pissed off politically, which again is just sort of a microcosm of what's happening to Julian Assange, to WikiLeaks, and to press freedom in general. And it's why way more motherfuckers need to be in the street over this.
Which, if you are someone that is interested in protesting in support of Julian, you don't have to go to a big event. You don't have to join us here in DC or with any of the other groups we have around the country. The thing we've advocated for since the very beginning is the idea of a decentralized protest, where you are the one person in your community that goes and hands out flyers and puts up posters and is willing to be Julian's voice in your city. Because unless you're willing to stand up and do these things, there's not going to be someone else in your town that does it. So I'd like to encourage everyone, especially throughout this weekend and into the last stage, hopefully, of this trial, that we can get more people on the ground acting. Over on actionforassange.com, we do have an action submission link. If you'd prefer to stay anonymous, please do. If you'd like to share them, please send them our way. We'll put them up on Twitter today and tomorrow. But that's just an easy way for us to be able to organize them better. If we get tagged in a lot of them, they kind of get lost in the shuffle of Twitter. So if you want to get your action promoted, please put it up on there, and we will put it out.
Speaking of lost in the shuffle on Twitter, there were a number of us yesterday who retweeted something that like our good friend Paula had put out, and it was just a clip of Jimmy Dore going off on people for not covering Assange. Of course my camera decides to take a shit during this. Why wouldn't it? There to even now when I look, like there's almost 100 fucking likes and RTs on thing. I've never received a single notification for this post. Misty never received a single notification for this post. Twitter is going out of its way to make it look like content related to Julian Assange is being ignored, even though he was trending yesterday. We live in a fucking cartoon. I don't really know what else to say about it. It's fucking ridiculous. Andrew, if you wanted to jump into the El País article, though, we can do that.
Yeah, we can jump in there. Do you want me to take it off, or do you want to take it?
Oh, go ahead and kick it off.
Okay. So this article is about
especially
the UC
because
Global.
it has complicated Spanish names in it.
Oh yes, my favorite. Just to catch people up in case you don't know, UC Global is a private intelligence firm that was tasked with monitoring the Ecuadorian embassy for the Ecuadorians, basically to keep it safe and keep Julian safe inside. What happened is Morales, the head of that private intelligence corporation, working hand in hand with Sheldon Adelson and the CIA, set up a backdoor so the CIA could get in and see the remote sessions that were going on. They set up live camera and microphone feeds throughout the entire embassy, including in the ladies' bathroom. So it's an ongoing case in the U.S. And that's where, or in Spain. I'm sorry, and that's where this article picks up. U.S. demands hinder the Spanish probe into alleged CIA ties to the security firm that spied on Assange. U.S. prosecutors want to know the judge's sources before cooperating in an investigation into whether UC Global gave intelligence services sensitive material on the WikiLeaks founder. And I'm going to switch some words around in here just because I don't think cyber activist is the correct wording. I love El País, and I'm not trying to take anything away from them. We just have a different set of language that we use. There will be no judicial cooperation forthcoming from the United States unless a Spanish judge reveals his information sources into an investigation into alleged espionage against the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange while he was living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Judge Jose de la Mata of the Spanish High Court was sent a request for judicial cooperation to U.S. attorneys as part of a probe into the Spanish private security company named UC Global SL and its owner, David Morales, on allegations that the firm secretly recorded Assange's private meetings with his lawyers, politicians, relatives, and journalists at the embassy, where he took refuge in 2012 to avoid separate legal proceedings against him in Sweden. Morales was arrested a year ago and released pending trial. According to testimony from several protected witnesses and former UC Global workers who gave evidence in connection with the case, Morales provided the CIA with recordings, video material, and reports detailing the activities of the 49-year-old Australian journalist inside the diplomatic mission, where he lived until he was illegally and arbitrarily detained in April of 2019. Judge De La Mata, who is heading the probe into UC Global, has asked the U.S. prosecutors for the IP addresses to the computers or other network devices that allegedly connected from American soil to the servers held by private intelligence firms at its headquarters in the southern Spain city. And that's listed right there. The server stored all of the recordings made by the cameras at the embassy where UC Global was in charge of security, as well as reports drafted by a company's employees detailing each visit that Assange received, images of the visitors' passports, and photographs of their cell phones and electronic devices. According to testimony by several ex-workers, as well as an email used in evidence in the investigation, U.S. intelligence services allegedly had access to this central server. U.S. prosecutors have now sent a letter to Maria.
Torres.
Yes, a liaison for the judge or for the Spain, liaison judge for Spain in the U.S., asking her to convey their demands to De La Mata. These include showing proof that the requested IP addresses are relevant and substantial to the investigation. The document requested further detail about the Spanish probe, including the sources of information for most of the assertions made in the request for judicial cooperation. The Spanish judge has been asked to answer a long list of questions regarding every aspect of his investigation, including who he believes Morales was providing information to, and whether or not the judge thinks Morales was working for a foreign information service or as an agent of a foreign power, or to whether it was simply a case of bribery. The U.S. prosecutors have asked that all this information be relayed before October 16th. Otherwise, it will be assumed that the Spanish authorities are not interested, and the request will be shelved. The Spanish judge has been asked whether a long list of questions regarding every aspect of his investigation, including who he believes Morales was providing information to. Is there anything you want to add, or you want me to keep going, Steve?
No, that I mean, we can expand on that, but the article itself is the rest of it's pretty much just a recap of what everybody already knows. This is this is an example of like death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. It's the U.S. regime using the legal system against I guess ultimately Julian Assange and his defense team for being able to include any of this information, which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the trial against Julian Assange is on its face illegal. They're trying to prevent any of that from coming to light, whether it's in a UK court or in the Eastern District of Virginia. If Julian's defense team is allowed to show the entire world that every single one of Julian's rights, be they legal, civil, or human, have been violated by the CIA years before trial, it renders the trial itself unnecessary. They would have to scrap it, start all over, and free the man.
And to compare it to the Pentagon Papers, this would broadly be the equivalent of how Daniel Ellsberg's case was thrown out, where it was because Ellsberg and the people around him were illegally wiretapped to figure out what they knew. I believe it was the plumbers that went to Ellsberg's house that installed observation devices back in the day. So this is the modern equivalent of plumbers installing cameras and microphones in your house. This is the CIA through a private intelligence corporation without a warrant, without evidence, without anything, just wanting to know what the hell was going on. So they elicited Morales, who then committed espionage against the nation of Ecuador, specifically and only to get information about Julian and his legal proceedings. And we know that the information that Julian was discussing with his lawyer is privileged legal material, which should be the basis for this whole case being thrown out once they actually get to the story in the UC Global case in court.
Fair enough. I would also like to point out that everyone who came in contact with Julian Assange during the time that UC Global was in the employ of the CIA had their civil liberties and human rights violated by this company. And we wouldn't know any of this if it weren't for a couple of employees who were like, you want me to do what? A diaper? Nah, man, I'm done. I'm walking away and I'm going to tell somebody from the media about this. So all the credit in the world, fucking camera, goes to goes to the couple of whistleblowers who worked inside of UC Global for this. We wouldn't have a Spanish court case. We wouldn't have this testimony, and we wouldn't have this information without them once again proving what a vital role a whistleblower plays in a functioning fucking society.
So
that it's end rant. I should have added that, or like done some. I don't know.
Oh no! I got that. It was the end. Do we want to? It's a short video. It's about a 2-minute video. That Twitter clip from Rebecca Vincent. Do we want to play that real quick?
Does Josh have it?
It should be.
I
It
should.
was in the doc. It's the DEA campaign tweet.
You need to mute Andrew when I play it because it's gonna echo otherwise.
That's fine. I got some background noise too.
That was the most I've seen her yet push back a bit on the prosecution, although I haven't been in for every moment of these proceedings. The prosecution seemed to be leading to a point that we don't quite know yet where they were going. And in fact, at the very end, she complained to the judge that, or started to complain that the witness was taking a long time in giving his responses, but the judge shut down that argument and said basically that the prosecution had taken quite a slow approach in building up their own case. So we'll see what happens in the second half tomorrow. But yes, it did focus on hypotheticals. I thought Mr. Schenkman actually responded very well, and his expertise in this matter was very clear, and he was very professional and good-natured despite this line of questioning and despite the technical difficulties as well. The prosecution in part seemed to be trying to get him to say that all of these matters of judicial interpretation mean that this should be a matter heard in the United States. But he pushed back very hard when that was suggested, I believe twice, and referred again to his belief that political offence is a bar to extraditions from the UK, and that this is a political case. He believes that this is a political application of the Espionage Act, so he stood his ground on that point.
Well, and they're both right. You can't remove the political nature of this prosecution from it. You flat out, it's impossible, and that's what's making the prosecution have their focus more narrow and narrow and narrow every time they go into the courtroom. Now, instead of being about even a computer crime, their focus is on, well, you released information about informants, and even though we have no proof for that, and even though in fact our argument gets refuted every time we put someone on the stand, we're going to try this one narrow ass avenue in order to achieve the ends of the extradition hearing, of the rendition hearing. Even though James Lewis, QC, said in open court, like, oh yeah, the United States has the right to prosecute journalists. The United States has the right to go after publishers. The United States has the right to go after anyone who has shared classified information. So the subtext is, anyone who has obtained or shared classified information is subject to 175 years imprisonment potentially. They're trying to distract by having this focus be about the released names of informants, which again we know to be bullshit. It's a cartoon.
And so into next week, I'm going to be waking up early and doing live court reporting. I don't have a video link, but I do have a bunch of people that do. So I'm going to be going through Kevin Gastola's tweets and all these other ones just to make sure that all of it gets put out there. The major themes, though, are that the QC Lewis, James Lewis, the prosecutor representing the United States, QC stands for Queen's Court, just in case anyone was wondering. He has very distinct and specific tactics that he tries, largely because it seems like he has no other case or foundation to go off of. But his major attempts are to discredit witnesses, to bully them into giving comments that generally backfire, literally just being an asshole trying to make people say things that they will almost always turn around on them. The Trevor Lewis one, I think, or Trevor Tim, is the best example of that. And we had talked about with Kevin Gastola, I believe it was Wednesday, about the possibility of the U.S. swapping out the prosecutors to bring in their backup hitter, essentially, because Lewis just kept striking out with every single attorney or with every single witness that he was questioning, literally to the point that they called the court because they were like, well, we're not asking this guy any more questions. They didn't call court, but he had 4 hours to ask questions and literally just decided to walk away because he was getting served so hard. So I want to take a moment to go through the at Defense Assange Twitter thread from yesterday, September 18th, just to go over Mrs. Dobbins' line of questioning that she had, because it was particularly interesting, because it's something that this was the U.S.'s attempt to switch prosecutors, to have Dobbins actually go after Schenkman instead. So could you get that tweet thread pulled up, Josh? It's the one. Okay, cool. So the prosecutor in this is Claire Dobbins. Little more backstory. This was the woman in the first week who lied about her husband having coronavirus symptoms, that got the court delayed 2 days, after Lewis woke up in the wrong house and didn't have his laptop charger or any of his papers because he left them at court. I assume that he planned on going back to court that day. And when you're running extremely late to the most important court trial, the easiest thing to do is call in sick. So just to preface that, because that's what they refer to as the COVID scare without giving any context, that Lewis was actually the one for an hour struggling to connect to the court technologies and all this. But nonetheless, this is Dobbins' questioning of Schenkman. Dobbins said, you're not suggesting that that there's any laws that journalists are protected from prosecution under the Espionage Act for the publication of national defense information. Schenkman replied, the Espionage Act is so broad that it allows for prosecution. Dobbins said, so we agree on this. The law doesn't prevent prosecution of journalists for this. To which Schenkman replies, well, there's no clause preventing it, but it is contentious, and there is a U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment that protects publishing. Dobbins continued, I understand you're arguing that, but you can't point to a case where it was precluded. It hasn't been brought before like this under the Espionage Act. So Dobbins continues, will you then accept that the New York Times Pentagon Papers case left the door open for such a prosecution? To where Schenkman said, I wouldn't say that it left the door open because it wasn't an issue before the court. It was an issue of prior restraint. The prosecution cites the Rosen case itself, which cites the Pentagon Papers case, where some justices accepted the prosecution would be constitutional. And this is Dobbins continuing again, do you agree that the prosecution under the Espionage Act is left open? Schenkman states Stephen Valdick is the press doomed after this ruling, but this is not the issue before the court involved in the oral transmission of information from the APAC case. This analysis shouldn't occur in a vacuum and must take in context the First Amendment. Schenkman continues, if there is an Espionage Act case before the case, I'm not sure the U.S. would cite this case because it sounds positive to its case, but the case was dropped. Dobbins said, so you would say that it is debatable either way? Schenkman said the issue was...
Can I interject here for a moment, Andre?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what this exchange is what everyone who watches all those fucking lawyer shows hopes to see in every episode. It's like two lawyers trying to out-lawyer each other. And Schenkman just destroyed this poor woman. And this, I mean, again, you know, she's the junior varsity for the prosecution, but because the varsity team for the prosecution is doing such a piss poor job in every single aspect of this case, they had to call her up and put her in front of arguably one of the more informed legal experts to take the witness stand so far. It's basically, if you can remember Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, it's basically your little character in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out going up against Mike Tyson for the very first time and getting hit once and being knocked out. So she tried to like outmaneuver this guy and failed miserably at every turn. Like, these are just argumentative backhands that have her very, very glad this happened on a Friday and she has a weekend in which to recover.
And in this next part here too, you can see where she's trying to pick up on like Lewis's behaviors. Like, I don't know if she's literally just learning how to do court stuff for the first time. But even her questioning is pretty absurd. So to pick up on that tweet that we left off at, Dobbins said, so you would say it is debatable either way. And this is a prosecution under the Espionage Act being okay. And Schenkman says, the issue was prior restraint. You have some Supreme Court justices who express some language about this. Schenkman continues, it would be better to discuss the case under the Espionage Act rather than hypotheticals. And this is where Miss Dobbins tries to play a Lewis card, and she says, so you're saying you're unqualified to comment? And Schenkman says, no, I'm not saying that, and I didn't say that. And then Dobbins goes, oh, right, moving on. And do you accept that the Espionage Act has been challenged on overbreadth and that those challenges have failed? It's been raised with regard to government employees. I'm surprised I knew what that meant. With regard to government employees, the set of facts is very different from the case on hand and very different constitutional concerns here. The whole body of this case on the Espionage Act, that's separate from the set of cases involving the media. So the language used in those cases doesn't necessarily apply here. And then Dobbins says, you're getting a field from the question. Do you accept that there have been vagueness challenges that failed? Schenkman says, I am trying to give context to my answer. If it wasn't complicated, I wouldn't have written 100,000 words on this.
How in the fuck are people keeping a straight face during these hearings? Like, I hope to God they're not. Like, I want Craig Murray to walk out of court one day as our man in the public gallery, which is what his articles about this are called, Your Man in the Public Gallery. And I want him to be like, yo, we needed Kleenex today because we were crying from laughing so hysterically at the way that the prosecution was utterly destroyed in there. Like, I want to hear some positive feedback that there have been multiple gallery outbursts during these proceedings, just because people can't stifle in the laugh.
Yeah, and it's because it is comical. You literally have the backup hitter, the second place attorney, trying to come in and act like the main attorney and do the same line of questioning, and ultimately failing miserably, like failing worse than Lewis did. And I honestly think it's hilarious that this was the person they sent Dobbins in on. I think it would have been better to have her question Ellsberg and then have Lewis question Schenkman personally. But I'm glad that they did it this way, because it just shows how amateur Dobbins is through this whole process.
Well, this is the woman who came up with the fake coronavirus scare last week.
Yep.
You know,
2 weeks ago.
Oh, my husband is experiencing COVID-like symptoms. Guess we better shut the trial down altogether. Like, we're still days behind in terms of calling witnesses and having their testimony. And this woman is thanking whatever God will take her that she did not have to question Khalid al-Masri. Like,
yeah.
the simple fact that he went through what he went through and can elucidate about it in a way that people can easily understand and digest would have broken her. Like, she would have forgot her laptop charger. She would have not made it back to her flat.
In the middle of open court, she'd have been like, oh, my laptop charger's at my flat. I got to go home. But so to continue with this, because it doesn't go on that much longer. And this is the one underneath where we were. Dobbins says, in your report, you do refer to the fact that the act, referring to the Espionage Act, has been refined over due to judicial interpretation. Schenkman replies, when you say the fact, there's been interpretations, but there's a dispute in the scholarship to whether they could be called refinement. For one thing, this is Shankman continuing. For one thing, the term national defense information has been subject to much interpretation. I don't think scholars would say that it has been refined to a sense that has been narrowed. If anything, there are some terms that have been broadened. And then there's a link there to Kerry Shankman's full statement. Dobbins continues. Dobbin goes to the case of the U.S. versus Morrison, assures that the government cannot abuse the statute and can only be used where there is a case for secrecy. And then if you're following the Twitter thread, there's a link to those cases. I'm sure we'll dig into them eventually. There's just a whole bunch of paperwork. But the prosecution is saying that these cases show that the Espionage Act can't be abused, only used for national defense information. Shankman says there's a lot of scholarship, including the Banksters, the Bankler, post 2010 on this. The problem with your citation is that it only deals with one phrase in the act, that hasn't been disputed and isn't agreed upon. There are overbreadth arguments that deal with many more issues within the act. Some legal standards. The same legal standards is cumbersomely applied to those. Applied to all these different categories, and there hasn't been a case like this one. All these deal with government insiders, the closest to oral transmission, but they do not address speaking to the media, and therefore they do not take the First Amendment into concern. And just to give a little context here as I keep going, Dobbins is literally arguing that any person, this is in so many words, but arguing that any person that's ever read a WikiLeaks disclosure that was marked classified could be arrested. That's the overbroad interpretation that Shankman's referring to, that Dobbins keeps going back to. So Dobbins continues, I am not going to go further because your report says the executive decides the scope of information protected, and that's obviously wrong. Shankman says it isn't. Various aspects here are a result of executive decisions. Law does not prohibit the application of this law against mainstream media, as well as individuals sharing the information on social media and even retweeting. Shankman continues, I am talking about the chilling effect that this prosecution has on the media. And that's all due to the breadth and overuse of this law. Says the decision to bring this is itself political. Dobbins moves on. Do you accept Section 793 of the Espionage Act provides room to prosecute beyond classical espionage? Shankman continues, I don't think any scholar would make a single claim about the original intent of the law when there has been when there has been disputes.
So real quick, if I can, they've been talking about Section 793 of the Espionage Act since pretty much day one of this trial, and you can sort of get an idea of where they're eventually headed with their arguments based on what they cite at the beginning. This particular section is one of those where they're using the vague language of the Espionage Act as it was originally written to over broadly apply it, as Andrew was saying, to every single citizen in the fucking country who has looked at a piece of classified information. If you are remotely concerned with government overreach, and I say this as like a good portion of the country is now freaking out over the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you need to be paying attention to this case. You need to be paying attention to the way that the prosecution is laying out their argument and what they expect the outcome to be, because it applies directly to, I'm going to guess, 100% of this audience, as we have all taken a look at classified information before. And then I'll go ahead.
Just to piggyback off that, whether you think the global issues are the deep state, the national security state, the globalists, the global capitalist empire, or what have you, this court case and this argument that Dobbins is putting forward here solidifies that whatever that evil is that you think is wrong in the world will have precedence over all other U.S. law, and if it goes through, international law. So I just want to make sure that people kind of grasp that, because that gets really lost in the weeds. But this case will determine whether or not national security laws supersede the U.S. Constitution, at the very least on the international stage. But in the first round of these trials, it was something that the prosecution argued would affect everyone, including U.S. media outlets, to be able to be prosecuted under this law with no First Amendment protection. So I just think that putting that into context and making sure that gets out there is particularly important, because this means that we no longer have a constitution and that national security law is the law of the United States. So let me pick up here. I'm going to go back a little bit to the section 973. Dobbins.
I'll jump in on this if
Okay.
you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Claire Dobbin, junior varsity, as bring you back up to speed in case you just jumped in. Claire Dobbin was struggling mightily with a lawyer on lawyer exchange here with Carrie Shankman. Do you accept 793 of the Espionage Act provides room to prosecute beyond classical espionage? Shankman, I don't think any scholar would make a single claim about the original intent of the law when there has been dispute. Shankman distinguishes between Congress in 1917 and 1950 when the law was amended versus the Court of Appeals in Morrison. Says these are separate questions. Dobbin still trying to get Shankman to comment on the intent of the act. Shankman repeatedly saying these are incredibly contentious issues with hundreds of pages of scholarship, not an agreed upon issue. Shankman also reminding court repeatedly that the cases Dobbin is citing don't deal with passing information to the media, so can't be considered an unambiguous interpretation to be applied to all cases. Which again is the point the prosecution is trying to make throughout these proceedings, that the vaguely worded section 793 applies not only to the media, but to each and every individual who is a U.S. citizen. Shankman, I don't think any of the scholars I've referenced here would agree on a yes or no on the questions you're asking, because Dobbin is trying to do what QC Lewis was unsuccessfully able to do, which is force people to answer yes or no to a leading and incorrectly asked question. Shankman talks about the significant chilling effect that these cases have brought about. So no, I don't agree they show restraint. If anything, the Nixon tapes show these cases were used to send a message. Of course, he's referring to the Pentagon Papers and Daniel Ellsberg. The chilling effect is what happens when journalists and publishers get targeted and taken down. It makes other journalists and other outlets want to censor themselves so that they don't stick their necks out and wind up in prison too. Shankman, successful prosecution is not all you need to instill a chilling effect on the press. The attempt is enough in some cases. Not even just about the media. This law can be used against anyone. Shankman citing Pentagon Papers being read into the congressional record by Mike Gravel as a precursor to WikiLeaks' desire to have full archives on record. By the way, I was listening to Joe Loria's coverage of the trial yesterday morning. Because Joe is a good friend of Mike Gravel, and he was a national security reporter during this time, and he confirmed that as Gravel is reading the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record, which he did like hella late at night, the night before the Supreme Court was ostensibly going to rule against Daniel Ellsberg. And it brought the man to tears. Now Mike Gravel is a naval intelligence officer and had been a sitting senator for a while. And reading the information in the Pentagon Papers brought him to tears. Can you imagine the breakdowns that would take place if people were trying to read Cablegate into the congressional record? By the way, you should read Cablegate into the congressional record. Also cited, Beacon Free Press desire to publish full Pentagon Papers. Dobbin repeatedly stopping Shankman's answers as too long. Dobbin, Do you understand the publication charges are only about the names of the sources? Shankman, I'm glad you brought that up.
That's real quick. That's my favorite line because that is the second time the U.S. prosecution has been so terrible that a witness says thank you for the question. Which, if you're trying to completely destroy free speech, you probably shouldn't elicit. I'm glad you brought that up twice in 2 weeks in the same court case. Sorry, I just.
Anywho, Shankman, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a curiosity of mine because the Espionage Act doesn't specifically address informants. The judge stops him, says to only answer the questions as asked. Final questionings. You also say the CFAA is extremely overbroad. Yes. Yes, you understand that what Professor Oren says is clear beyond doubt. Constituting hacking is the same as what's alleged against Mr. Assange. No, I don't. And that's not exactly what the professor says. Shankman cites Professor Oren Kerr's comment on the CFAA charge against Assange from April 11, 2019. Here, thinks it contradicts what Dobbin said that Kerr believes. So here we have a full document that I honestly, like, if you guys are in the chat right now, you want to go take a look at this, please do that. I'll make sure that there's a link to it in my chat, because there's some nuts and bolts legalese here that you can also apply in case anyone tries to bring up the canard that Julian Assange personally is a hacker and sought these documents through extrajudicial means. Jumping down, Dobbin, I think it's extremely clear that he'd agree with what's alleged against Assange would constitute hacking. Shankman, well, you can take his words in 2010 or in 2019, and that was the end of cross-examination.
So,
man,
Dobbins,
I mean, look, dude, I am not an advocate or in any way, shape, or form do I condone abusing a woman. Having said that, she got her ass kicked, and just based on the team that she chose for this, it kind of deserved it. It looks like our other co-host and good friend Kendra Christian is checking in live from Denver, so let's kick it over to her.
Hey guys, how are you doing?
good. How are you?
I'm good. Hopefully we can get this figured out. We're getting ready to start. I'm gonna have Genty film, and I'm gonna go introduce our speakers. So I figure, hopefully it works and you guys can hear everything, and if not, then you can always mute me. So, Genty.
Hi, Genty. We missed you.
Missed you guys. Good to see you again. I don't know if you can see me out here.
We can see you.
Yeah, we can see you. The camera's facing you.
Yep.
Oh, nice. It's bright as shit out here.
So where are you guys at right now out in Denver? Where are you guys outside of?
We're in Denver at it's called Cheeseman Park, and got a couple radio personalities out here, so looking forward to that.
Because I think this is, if I remember right, this is your guys' second demonstration during this time that you guys did something. I think it was the 7th when everything kicked off. You guys had a demonstration out in Denver too.
We started our group
about
a little over a year ago. Back in June was our first.
Kendra's up here, so I'll turn it
Okay.
over.
We're really excited today to have two great speakers. Definitely, it's been a challenge with the mainstream press not supporting or reporting on this cause, not defending freedom of press. So we're really excited to have two, independent journalists who've really changed the landscape, especially in Colorado and even internationally. And we're really grateful to have them here. So our first speaker is Irene Rodriguez. And she has reported from the streets for over 10 years in countries such as Colombia, France, Honduras, Poland, Qatar, and South Africa. She has reported for KGNU and Free Speech News and is currently the co-founder of The Nation Report, a local and independent news outlet focusing on exposing civil, human, and non-human animal rights violations. So, Irene Rodriguez.
Thank you so much for coming. Is this clear enough for you?
Can you take your mask off, do you think, while you're talking?
It was pretty clear though.
Well, okay. Okay, all right. Can you adjust it though?
All right, Steve, make sure you mute. I'm gonna boost the audio a little bit.
Ancestors, the Ute and Arapaho for permission to speak. Thank you. The first time I learned about, also thank you, Kendra, for inviting me, James, for arranging this. The first time I learned about Julian, I think was in 2010 after when the Baghdad strike was exposed. And at that time I was a teacher in an elementary school. I was an educator in special ed. And I was so upset, especially to learn about the children who had been massacred. And this is the last time I'm going to say strike. It was a massacre. I was so upset, and one of my colleagues asked me why I was upset, and I said mostly because of the children and that my government had killed innocent people. So the next day she came back and she said, I really don't think you know what you're talking about. I didn't see anything reported about it. And so it was then that I knew that I needed to do more to inform people about what my government was doing. So there are so many things, there are so many illegalities that needed to be exposed, and I felt overwhelmed because I'm just one person. David and I are just two people. And so I decided to go independent and take on more than I was taking on. And so after there was the Iran strike, the Iraq strike, also I'm using the narrative of media, and I don't want to do that, and I want to speak about our controlling the narrative better than we have been, and not just assuming the narrative of media. And furthermore, I mean, we should also be glad that the media is even covering some of these things, which they're not, of the trial. And if they are, there are some very biased, there's very biased reporting happening. And so we have to, and I know a lot of people here, I think you do this anyway. You're very critical of what you see and what you read, and that's good. Hopefully there are people on the live stream who will challenge what you're saying and hearing on the media and not accept that narrative, not accept the terminology, and at least form your own opinions from researching, doing your own research and researching further. Back when I was a teacher at an elementary school, I was working with a little boy who spoke only Spanish, and I was in the area of autism, and one day he and I got locked out of the school, and we pounded and pounded on the door and couldn't get back in. So I went to the principal's office and I said, I really need a key because this is not safe for us to be. He was acting out and having a tantrum on the ground and hitting himself on the cement. And I said, this isn't safe for us to be outside. And the response I got was, you can't have a key because of security. And I especially want to challenge that word security, because I was expected to be quiet because everything was secure. And this is the narrative that we're getting from our government, that Julian needs to be prosecuted because he exposed secrets of the U.S., challenging and threatening our security. I'd like for people to very much challenge that narrative. I'd also
We can hear fine.
Okay, cool.
concerning media and mainstream media, especially, to challenge and recognize the mistakes, the omissions, the presumptions, the inaccuracies. We all make mistakes, but I also want to challenge those that are the propaganda machines of the U.S. government. Now, in the Nation Report email, I receive all of the government press releases, and I was astounded the first time they started coming in. There was very inaccurate reporting about what was happening in Colombia and Honduras and Venezuela, and things that I had seen were not true. I had witnessed very accurate and well documented fair elections in Venezuela, for example, and that's not what was coming out of our government. So again, back to my point of challenging media. After Julian Assange was taken into custody, and it was suggested that he could be extradited to the U.S., I also learned that he, and you all probably know this, that it was considered that he could, once extradited, would be transferred to Florence Supermax. And how many of you know about Florence Supermax? And how about
Florence is like right down the road from them.
For Florence is? I've been there once, and this was to challenge the incarceration of Ricardo Palmera, also known as Simon Trinidad, a member of the FARC rebel group in Colombia, and also of one of his comrades, Añadi Rojas Valderrama, who also was with the FARC. And it is in the U.S. interest to keep him incarcerated, though many believe, and there's much documentation to show that he was wrongly incarcerated there. His attorney is actually from Denver and has worked for years, but I could not get in to talk to him. No journalist has been able to get into Supermax up to that point. They also held, the Supermax also held Antonio Guerrero, one of the Cuban Five, who was actually eventually released. So that's promising, at least that the three people I know wrongly accused were released. So I'm hopeful that maybe he won't even be sent there, but the reports of solitary confinement coming from there are a little bit scary.
Looks like you guys turned off video.
WikiLeaks released the Yemen files exposing crimes against an already suffering people of Yemen. And Assange writes, the war in Yemen has produced 3.15 million internally displaced persons, although the U.S. government has provided most of the bombs and is deeply involved in the conduct of the war itself. Reportage on the war in English is rare. I was examining Twitter last week, and I saw that a group of people, Trump supporters, were asked, why are you going to vote for him? And some of the responses were, one, he has cured our national debt. and 2, he's close to eliminating COVID in this country. And 3 was he's making it easy for people to vote. And there were more. And so I really want to stress the importance of independent media. These people, there was another one by Stephen Colbert who talked to people, Trump supporters also, and their information is completely inaccurate, but they so strongly believe it. And so I just want to, and like I say, I know a lot of people here want to reemphasize your support, the importance of your support for independent media. To talk more locally, I wanted to talk about some things that are happening to me here in Denver. Back in 2011, during the occupied Denver occupation of City Park, I'm sorry, what park? Civic Center? Civic Center Park, sorry. The police especially wanted to dismantle the Thunderdome kitchen. And I was standing, well, a lot happened, but I was standing behind a huge telephone post where I really couldn't even be seen. And the cops started yelling for everybody to get back. And this, I think State Patrol was conducting this part of the raid. And State Patrol reached behind the post and took his stick and hit me on one side. And then when I turned, he hit me on the other side. And I fell to the ground and he stepped on me. Then the violence escalated on the part of police. And the police began shooting randomly, rubber-coated bullets, pepper spray, and even shot somebody who was videotaping from a tree and shot him down off of a tree. And the report and I'll go ahead and name the publication, the Denver Post, was that officers did not conduct any violence first towards anybody, that they had only responded to violence. And I saw that wasn't true. And so it was that day I knew that I needed to do more locally than what I was doing. Fast forward to 2018, in the Capitol, I was reporting on a hearing, and one of the sergeants at arms, well, first what I usually do is, in order to get speakers' names correctly, I review the logs. And instead of the clerks waiting for me to write down some of the names, I take pictures of them. And a sergeant at arms came over to me and he said, "Stop!" And he put his body over mine and covered the ledger. And I said something like, "What are you doing?" And then the clerk said, "It's okay, she has permission." And he escalated and escalated. And to this day, he still works there. Fast forward to 2019, I'm also appearing to report on a hearing, and I'm at the back of the room, and what I usually do is take a picture of all of the audience from the back, and then I'll take my seat or go to the side of the room to take pictures of the speakers. And in the back of the room, there were several people standing, and then there were several seats, and then several people sitting. And the sergeant at arms crossed over all those people to come over to me in the corner of the room and say, "Sit down." And I said, "No, I'm not sitting down. Nobody needs to sit down at these hearings if they're not overcrowded." And he said, "You need to sit down now or I'm going to call the State Patrol." And I said, "Okay, go ahead." And so I continued to take my pictures, and in walks 5 State Patrol and tell me that I needed to leave. And I said, "I'm not leaving, I'm reporting. And they said, they escalated also. It got really loud. And so I knew one of the legislators and I knew somebody in the audience who I said, let's go out, we're disturbing. So we went outside and they threatened to arrest me again. They demanded to see my credentials, which isn't required, isn't a legal requirement. And um, and the sergeant at arms escalated again and came over to me and started pointing his finger until he's touching my nose. And I eventually just left. I have 2 complaints standing for those incidents. But fast forward again to later reporting from the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission meetings. And I'm standing with the reporters and doing what I usually do, putting my microphone down, and I'm taking pictures of people testifying. And the director, Jeff Robbins, came over to me and said, this is a reporter's area, you're going to need to sit down. And I said, no, I don't need to sit down. I'm standing where I usually stand. I've reported from several of these meetings. And he said, if you don't leave, I'm going to call the police to move you. And he said, what outlet are you with? And I said, the Nation Report. And he said, well, let me see it, pull it up on your phone. And I said, did you ask all of these reporters to pull it up on their phone? Somebody standing next to me said, he didn't ask me. And so I said, I'm not going to be treated differently than other people.
I don't know about y'all, but I'm thoroughly enjoying this.
Left the room, came back with some police, and I just thought at this point, I'm done. Okay, if you want to arrest me, go ahead. But the cop just kind of stood next to me, and I continued on. I reported all of these to Jared Pullis and got no response. So I'd like to finish by saying that one, we have an eye on you. We may be few right now. There are people online who may be sharing. You don't know the power of one of these people. And we want to relay the message that we are watching. And the other message is, my message is to the greater media enterprise, be like Julian Assange. Ruth Bader Ginsburg Presente. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Irene. I think that was so great to hear from you, because that's exactly why we're here. Julian Assange is not alone. This is anybody who wants to say truthful information that exposes things that powerful people don't want exposed. So thank you so much for sharing those, for your speech and sharing those stories with us. So I just have to sign into this phone.
I just want to state for the record that I'm totally starting a folk punk band called Kendra's Rolled Up Sleeves.
And wide-ranging investigative journalists, David Barsamian, who authored the Independent Media Landscape, both his weekly program, Alternative Radio, 34 years running, and his books with Noam Chomsky, Iqbal Ahmed, Howard Zinn, Tariq Ali, Richard Wolff. So we're really excited to have him here today. He also, his new book is out, correct? And it is, sorry, remind me. Retargeting Iran, which is, he also has a book previously targeting Iran. So here we are again, retargeting Iran. So David?
Thank you, Kendra, and thank you all for turning out on this glorious Saturday morning. It's good to see your smiling faces, some of whom I know personally. Thanks to Kendra. This is how social change happens when small groups of people, Margaret Mead reminded us, small groups of people get together and those groups get larger and larger. And so what seemed to be insurmountable obstacles become quite attainable. And that we cannot give up the spirit and the élan and the joie de vivre that we all need to sustain ourselves in these very dangerous times. Telling the truth in a time of universal deceit is a revolutionary act. Supposedly this is attributed to Orwell, but he probably didn't say it, but it doesn't matter. It is the truth. It is a revolutionary act in a time of universal deceit to speak the truth. And journalists have historically played that role in democratic societies. Journalism is considered the fourth estate. It's going to hold power, to the feet of power. It's going to hold them accountable. I am a critic of corporate media, as you may know, and I've written about it. I've done many programs about it. It has a lot of shortcomings and a lot of failings. We do exist. There's independent alternative media that's out there, that's excellent, that needs your support, such as, I dare say, my own program, Alternative Radio, which you can hear on KGNU Wednesday evenings from 6 to 7, 1390 AM here in Denver, 88.5 FM in Boulder and Fort Collins and in other areas. The wonderful Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Is a great source of independent and radical information. Let's not beat around the bushes here. We're not talking about, currying favor with the ruling class and just focusing on their errors here and there. That's a fundamental ploy to distract attention from people to understand what's actually going on. So we look at this, did the president, I won't even mention his name, did the tweeter in chief, tell a lie on this occasion? We have to look at the systems that produce these kinds of characters over and over again. So there's fundamental things need to be examined and scrutinized, and not focusing on cosmetic issues, on whether, my lipstick is too bright or my eyeshadow is not correct, and the like. You look okay to us. Assange, of course, is in a long line of heroic whistleblowers, people who have dared to tell the truth, starting, centuries ago. But in our lifetimes, I'm speaking for some of you here, we remember Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, which demonstrated incontrovertibly the hypocrisy and the cynicism and the outright mendacity of the best and the brightest. Remember, that's how the Kennedy Johnson.
Kendra's video got turned off.
Like Robert,
I think it got clicked by accident.
I think it's battery.
And it was Ellsberg that leaked the Pentagon Papers. And he was going to be prosecuted by the criminal president Richard M. Nixon for divulging state secrets. Notice, it was a state secret to lie to the American people. That was the crime that Ellsberg was being vilified for and demonized, much in the same way that Julian Assange today is being vilified and demonized. Now, Ellsberg was fully expected, and as was Noam Chomsky and others, they were expected to go to jail. But after it was revealed of the criminality of the regime in Washington, particularly the invasion of Ellsberg's doctor's office, and also, of course, the Watergate complex, fortunately, those charges were dropped. If you go back a little bit further in U.S. history to the 1930s, General Smedley Butler exposed the crimes of U.S. imperialism, particularly in Central and Latin America, but also in China as well. Look him up, General Smedley Butler. a heroic figure who revealed the militarized aspect of almost all of U.S. Foreign policy. And he said,
We got to get
I
this
was a
old hippie
muscle
on a
man
vigil.
for the big boys on Wall Street. I kept the bankers safe in Nicaragua, and on and on. It's a wonderful book. It's very short, actually. It's called War is a Racket. Essential reading to understanding what American democracy is really about. Not the fairy tales that are taught in most colleges and facts about the history of this country. And of course, around the time of Ellsberg,
When we cut away
the
from this, I want to expand on a couple of his points.
Nixon administration. He was
Absolutely. My desktop just kicked me off, but I'm still on my phone.
As John Trudell sometimes calls it. And his name was Mark Felt. His identity was not revealed until just a few years ago. But it's very, very significant that he talked to Carl Bernstein, to Bob Woodward about the crimes of the regime. Someone who was not afraid to speak out. That is what is so crucial to the functioning of any kind of democracy. Because when people are intimidated, when people are afraid to speak, democracy is diminishing. Democracy is, excuse me, democracy is at risk.
Here, here.
Karen Silkwood was a whistleblower. Few of you may have heard of her. There was a terrific, actually, a really good film about her called Silkwood. Excuse me. Showing that Carnegie, a big, nuke factory reactor conglomerate in Oklahoma, was in fact operating very unsafe reactors, putting great people in danger. Karen Silkwood paid with her life in what is still described as a very suspicious auto accident. Coming down to more recent days, there's of course Edward Snowden, his revelations about the NSA's spying surveillance on Americans and people all over the world. The extent of that, of course, the whistleblowing of the heroic Chelsea Manning, and also, of course, Julian Assange, who obtained some of the documents that Chelsea Manning obtained and released them to the general public, really showing the underbelly and the ferocity of U.S. imperialism. All you need to know about the Iraq War and the many other wars that are fought by the United States, of course, always in the name of freedom and democracy and liberating others who are not as fortunate as we are to be living in a free and democratic society. All you need to know is to look at the video of collateral murder. When the helicopter pilots in Baghdad were chortling, look how we lit them up, was deliberately committing extrajudicial assassinations, a clear war crime. Was there any prosecution? Was there any outrage? There was nothing until Manning released these films to WikiLeaks, to Julian Assange, who then published them. Julian Assange, you have to understand, he's a journalist, he's an activist, but he's also a publisher. So the threats against him, the prosecution and the persecution, if I may say, against him is a threat to journalists all over the world, and it's a threat to the citizens of a free society. And let's not forget, because we often do, given the dire straits that we are in with the current regime in Washington, that it was under a liberal Democratic president and a liberal Democratic Secretary of State, I'm talking about Barack Obama and John Kerry, that there was prosecution of Edward Snowden. In fact, Kerry canceled his passport. That's why he's in Russia. He can't travel because the United States is now, of course, has been insisting on its extradition, the extradition of Snowden. So we have courageous journalists out there that are doing terrific work, like Laura Poitras, like Liliane Segura, like Glenn Snowden, like Jeremy Scahill. We've got really good reporters out there. We don't have the tools to reach a large audience. So that's where, independent media need to be nurtured and supported by you, and by getting involved and, by direct contributions. Criminalizing heroic journalists who are doing their job, speaking truth to power, is, of course, unacceptable. We should be celebrating and honoring these people who dare to speak out. The exact opposite of what is going on.
Thank you, Julian.
Yes.
We're in a Martin Niemöller moment. For those of you who've heard me speak before, I've mentioned the German pastor who was a U-boat officer in World War I. After the war, maybe because of what happened to him, his experiences, he became a pacifist and a Lutheran minister. His name may not be well known to you, but it was Niemöller who comprised the poem. He composed a poem, Next They Came For. You might remember that. First they came for the communists and the socialists, and I wasn't a communist or a socialist. I didn't say anything. Then they came for the gays and lesbians and transgender people. I didn't say anything. I kept quiet. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't say anything. I remained silent. That silence is death. That silence is killing. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak out. So we have to remember, and Niemöller paid a price. Because he was a World War I war hero, they couldn't execute him, but he was in Dachau and Sachsenhausen prison camps from 1937 until the liberation of those camps in 1945. So it's dangerous out there. Those waters run deep, and power will do anything and everything to protect itself and to insulate itself from we the people. We the people is, again, a rhetorical device. They're actually afraid of we the people. They want us to be immersed in the latest Kardashian scandal, or the latest divorce, or will baseball come back, and will the Broncos reach the playoffs? All weapons of mass distraction to get our attention away from what is actually going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
The current occupant, that's how I refer to him, of the Oval Orifice,
The great prevaricator.
or the Oral Office, has, according to the Washington Post, which is no radical newspaper, by the way, but it's owned by Jeff Bezos of Amazon and has come under a particular attack by the great leader in the White House. They report that in the 3.5 years of this current regime in Washington, that there have been 20,000 lies that have been documented. And that's a pretty good clip. I mean, you have to take your hats off to the liar-in-chief to generate so much mendacity in such a short period of time. And curiously, like Reagan years ago, Teflon, seems that nothing sticks. One revelatory book after another comes out. First, a whole stream of them, but the most recent ones, his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, then his niece, Mary Trump, then Bob Woodward, of course, is out right now. His personal attorney, Michael Cohen, book after book. But to those who worship the great prevaricator in Washington, it doesn't seem to rise to any great moment, because they have been thoroughly indoctrinated with the propaganda of Breitbart News, of InfoWars, of QAnon, of Red State, of Max State, all of these right-wing media outlets, and how could I forget the
I
illustrious
consider MSNBC a right-wing media outlet.
Fox, with such truth tellers, in quotes, like Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson.
I agree.
An amazing group of, you really can't call them journalists because they really do no investigative work at all. They are mouthpieces for the current regime in Washington. But even with all of this negative publicity generated by all of these books and all of these revelations, it doesn't seem to matter. And according to Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's brilliant propaganda minister, he said, even when the Nazis were being criticized in the 1920s and early 1930s, when it was still possible to criticize them, he said it doesn't matter. The main thing is they're talking about us. We have their attention. And you see how the corporate media obsequiously lead story after story with what the president said today. What was the comment of the day? What happened at the press conference? Instead of doing an end run around that propaganda, they repeat. They're giving airtime to the prevaricator in chief. And that produces this enormous amount of disinformation and dysfunction, and I dare say despair. So how did, going back into history, because history informs the present, how did a small party around a man in Germany in the 1920s seize power in one of the most sophisticated and advanced countries on earth in that period? Talking about, of course, Germany and Adolf Hitler. Germany was no backwater. It was at the center of the arts, education, scholarship, science. 75% of all scientific papers written in the 1920s were in German, not in English. There were writers like Thomas Mann, filmmakers like Fritz Lang, painters like Paul Klee, poets like Bertolt Brecht, composers like Kurt Weill, and architects like Walter Gropius. Post-war scholar and brilliant writer Hannah Arendt. She wrote a book called Origins of Totalitarianism. The chapter on propaganda is most edifying, and if you read any part of that big book, just read that chapter on propaganda and the origins of the totalitarian autocratic mindset. Why the constant blatant lying, she asked. She recognized the function of an avalanche of lies to render a population powerless to resist. The phenomena that we now call gaslighting, just wave after wave of lies, of half-truths, of quarter-truths, flooding the landscape, indoctrinating people. And the essential conviction shared, and this is what Arendt writes, is that the Führer, in this case Adolf Hitler, is always right. Well, you could also substitute, the great leader in Washington today. To his followers, he is always right. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point, this is Arendt again, in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. Mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that the next day they will have forgotten them. So you see the kind of lies that are being promulgated in social media, leading to very bad outcomes, and the most infamous one being the Pizzagate incident, where someone picked up a gun in North Carolina and drove to Washington, D.C. to invade a pizza house where supposedly Democrats led by Hillary Clinton were running a pedophile ring in its basement. Fortunately, no one was killed, but there have been deaths now in recent times around people who subscribe to these outrageous ideas that Zuckerberg, and Facebook, and Snapchat, and Google, and the other mass social media are allowing to propagate now and to promote. This raises a very important issue of, freedom of the press. Do they have a right to speak? Of course, they have a right to speak. But does that right extend to endangering people's lives as a result of lying, as a result of propaganda? This is something that I think needs to be sorted out. Now, I could keep going here. I think, Assange is a heroic figure and should be celebrated and honored. Let me just very briefly, because I know some of you want to go. The WikiLeaks diplomatic cables revealed a massive trove of documentation on U.S. relations, particularly in the Middle East, which has been an obsession for Washington policymakers since the end of World War II, with its unholy alliances with holy regimes like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Kuwait and the other Arab dictatorships, and the Shah of Iran, of course, who was not an Arab, and dictatorships in Turkey and neighboring Pakistan as well. The cables that were released by WikiLeaks show an understanding of how U.S. national security state manages its interests in the Middle East. In particularly, they shed light on how the United States accommodated the interests of Israel. Now, I know as soon as you hear the word Israel, hackles go up and people get extremely defensive, and it is very difficult in this country, given the propaganda, to have an honest discussion about U.S.-Israeli relations. People are slandered, called anti-Semites. Sorry about that. They're called anti-Semites, etc. But the Israel factor pervades the formulation and implementation of U.S. Middle East policy. U.S. support for the continuation of Israeli military dominance in the Middle East is the primary nexus between that domestic interest group, the Israeli lobby, which is so powerful, and U.S. diplomacy. And we just saw a spectacle a few days ago of retro regimes, Arab regimes like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, signing an agreement with Israel. And in return, they will be amply rewarded by the military-industrial complex, which is very happy to sell them F-35s. Thank you very, very, very much. It's always been about power and the exerting power in the Middle East at the expense of the Palestinians and other groups in the region who have been marginalized and shunted aside. This is one of the dramatic features of U.S. foreign policy that is barely talked about in any honest way in any of the media in the United States, particularly the corporate media. So I think we need action, we need engagement. This is no time for despair or depression. The great Eduardo Galeano of Uruguay used to say, save despair and depression for better times when we're winning. Right now, it's not appropriate. Right now, we need people like Kendra to step up and that generation to take charge and lead the way, because we are in an extremely dangerous situation. Now, you may know that the great leader just a couple of days ago insulted the memory and defamed the memory of our great radical historian, Howard Zinn. Zinn, what was Zinn's crime in the view of the great leader? He revealed unpleasant aspects of United States history, the founding of the country. So you might find slavery an unpleasant aspect. It's not very pleasant, going back to 1619. You may find the genocide of the indigenous population an unpleasant aspect of U.S. History. The great leader was moaning and whining and complaining. You know, why don't they celebrate us? Why don't they show the great things that we did? Why do they just focus on these particular things, which he did not actually mention by name? But Howard Zinn was a heroic figure in his own right, someone who always spoke truth to power. And he said this: to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history.
I want this
is a
guy and
mission.
Ray McGovern on at the same time so they can do a character voice off.
Courage, kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory. I was in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in 2003 when Arundhati Roy gave these comments. Our strategy, I should preface that by telling you that Roy herself is under enormous
We lose a feed.
We might have lost battery from them.
I really wanted to hear that part. But in case it does not come back, I want to thank the Action to Free Assange Denver crew, with Kendra and Genti and all the rest of them out there for putting this on today for us, and then hooking up with us at this time so we can live stream. I really appreciate that, because this is being able to bring actual like live streams and events of what's going on, I think is really fun. So I appreciate them being able to do that.
And just one more time, the speakers were Irene Rodriguez and David Barsemian. Irene writes for The Nation Report, and David is a radio DJ out there in Colorado. And by the way, dude, both of those guys would be great to have on a vigil.
Absolutely.
So I'm not kidding about that, dude. I definitely want a character voice off between Ray McGovern and David Barsemian. That would be just fucking epic.
And one of the things I want to, that the second speaker, I think that was David, brought up a whole bunch of times, that I think is extremely important, is supporting independent media. What we're going to do is put out a little like thank you to everyone that has covered Julian's trial and has covered him during this time. If you could, we'll go through and find links, but as the audience, if you run into any creators that do make videos about Julian, please send them our way. We'll retweet them out. We'll give them shout outs and say thank you. As we're getting our new site built, we're going to go as far, sorry, my mic was way over there. We're going to go as far as to put the people that are covering him up on there and saying thank you and directing people to their videos that they're making. Because our community has the amazing ability to come together and provide financial resources to people. Like you guys have been amazing helping us raise the money to get out here. And we couldn't have done it without our community. So I would like to say to the people that did donate to the GoFundMe, thank you so much for doing it. And please look for the independent content creators that are covering Julian's situation right now, covering his trial, or at least speaking about him in some way. And give them some extra money, whether it's upping a Patreon subscription, hopping over and signing up on Rockfin or what have you. It's super important that this information gets out and gets covered, and showing financial support to content creators that do so is a really big way, especially if you say this money is because you supported Julian Assange during his trial. So I think that would be that will eventually, once DC is over, be a call to action. But I want to make sure that I can get those informations together and get all that in one spot to be able to say thank you properly to everybody that is covering this.
And I said this on Twitter the other day, but let me reiterate it right now. All of September and October super chats to Slow News Day, I'm going to then kick over to Shadowproof. Just because Kevin Costola has been fucking crushing it, and he hangs out with us, so there's a little bit of bias on that, but yeah, it's definitely a deserving outlet, and one that I decided to, I guess, support with contributions that are made to this channel. So thank you.
Did you want to talk about any of the points that were brought up during that speech by David, I think his name was?
I did. There were a couple of things that he discussed that I think we can expand on a little bit. And one is like the fact that he was harping a bit on quote unquote right-wing media, like as horrific as right-wing media is, in context of the case against Julian Assange, it goes a little bit broader than that. Like, as the reality of it is that you have to go to some complete neocon shitheel show like Tucker Carlson's in order to hear 3 minutes of reality about Julian Assange, because there's nowhere in the quote liberal media unquote that anyone is having that conversation. Not even on fucking Democracy Now. Like, that's just heartbreaking to me.
And that's why I think supporting creators that are covering it so important right now. Just telling them, sorry, there's a motorcycle. Just telling them thank you goes a really, really long way, because especially the people that are waking up early to put the tweets out, Kevin Costola, Juan Passarelli, and all of the others, because it's a feat. Like, it is a heroic feat to have to get up and be competent that early in the morning to be able to cross-reference and pull all this information together while still having to transcribe it into written form while it's happening. So big thank you to those people.
Yeah, and there's I'm like, since the trial began, Richard Medhurst, who was on last Saturday, has been dragging his ass out of bed early. Now that I'm back in California through no choice of my own, would be like me waking up at 2:00 in the morning in order to cover this, but I sleep like shit anyway. So I'm probably gonna give that a shot as we go into week 3. I'll at least make as many of those as I can, and then going forward into week 3, hopefully we'll be able to connect again with Kevin Costola, at least on lunch break for the court in the UK, and be able to have a little bit more full discussion about what's going on, since he does have access to the live feed, and it's illegal for us to piggyback off of it.
The hope next week too is to get a lot of the people doing the video cloud software during these recesses, because the court does take large recesses rather often, to come in and chit chat about it, to give us their opinions, to provide context on things, because they do such a wonderful job there getting all that stuff put together. So we're going to try to get Mohammed Almazi, Juan Passarelli, and all these other people that will be up at a computer screen at that time on with us, because I think that would be cool to be able to let them talk about what they heard, because that's one of the things that not having an open media gallery, one of the issues that it creates, at least in my super unprofessional, never been in a media gallery for court reporting opinion, is they can't share back and forth, to where during the February proceedings, there was a lot of times where we had like Mohammed on or somebody, and they would talk about how they would write something down, they would talk about it on breaks and be able to give each other more context, because maybe one person had written something and while they were writing, the judge said something else that another person wrote down. So I'm really hoping that we can kind of facilitate that sort of cross conversation that would happen naturally at court, because I think that getting journalists together as it's happening to discuss it is also super important. So I really look forward to what we can manage to pull together for this third week of the court trials.
And at this point, we've been going for about 2 hours. So I know I've got like my house is still fucked off from smoke damage and shit. I haven't really had a moment since I got off the plane. I went straight back to work. My shit's thrashed. I should probably hop off.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get the new call to action put up here shortly. Again, it is going to be contacting all of the members of the Australian Parliament. And then I will be putting that up on the website. I think the camera's frozen on you, Steve. There we go. It just kicked over to me. But thank you guys very much for joining us. My name is Andrew Smith. You can follow me on Twitter at Andrew Zigmund, Zigmund. You can follow us and everything Action for Assange does on action_4 Assange on Twitter and action4assange.com online. We will be this evening posting the DC schedule because we are still here. I have my wonderful brick wall and window behind me. We are going for another week of actions throughout this city. So we look forward to getting that posted soon because we are constantly changing and evolving them based on the experiences that we've had here throughout the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, activism is basically like it's very similar to going through the process of like writing and shooting a movie. There's the thing that you write beforehand, and then there's the thing that happens during the course of it, and then there's the finished product. It's great to have a schedule, but it's really, really hard to keep to that schedule once you realize what the conditions on the ground are. Having said that, my name's Steve Poikinen. I host a show called Slow News Day. If you're looking for it on YouTube, you type in Slow News Day Podcast into the search bar. I am on Rockfin and D Live. I will be joined tomorrow by the incomparable Elizabeth Voss. Looking forward to that conversation as always. Huge thanks to Andre and to Sleepy Josh on the ones and twos, to Kendra Christian for organizing a great event in Denver and allowing us to live stream it. And we will see you probably bright and early Monday. Good luck.
Real quick before
I just said the thing. You can't make another statement after I say the thing. Like,
well, I interrupted the thing.
It's how it goes.
So we had a couple questions that I just want to.
Smith.
Sorry, we had a couple questions in chat that I wanted to address real quick. What day are we at for Julian's trial? Yesterday was the conclusion of the second week of the second phase of Julian's trial. It was supposed to be day 10, but because of court delays and all of that, it was the 9th day. It was the 8th day of actual proceedings, though. So we have. I don't want to give the count now, but we've lost about 3 or 4 days of proceedings due to technical issues, which is why we have that call to action up. Another question we had was, what is the latest update on his case? Is there still a COVID bind up? No, there is not. For the latest updates, go over to Shadowproof on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube right now, they put out all the live court updates. The last thing that happened really was the U.S. prosecution failing miserably. And we covered that a bit earlier. And then the last question is from the always wonderful Nat Riviera. And she says, when is the last day of the hearings? That is an interesting question. And it's probably
supposed to be the 25th of September, but because of the way that they have just royally screwed everything, it might spill over into a 4th week.
It's actually interesting. If you look at the witness document, they actually say 4 weeks instead of 3 on that paper. So it almost seems premeditated that it would take longer than expected. So I just
Action for Assange will be tent camping in Washington, D.C. for the 4th week of this.
Oh God, please don't make me do that. I'll die. But again, thank you everyone. Steve.
Good luck to us all.